In the spring of 1834, a Florida plantation owner paid an extraordinary sum for a single enslaved woman named Eliza. Over the next 11 years, 4 children would be born at Meridian Grove Plantation, their existence documented in baptismal records, their parentage deliberately obscured. Property records show the construction of a separate dwelling hidden by live oaks, positioned 200 yards from the main house, and accessible only by a path the overseer was instructed never to patrol. For over 180 years, the Ashton family maintained these children were offspring of enslaved workers, that Eliza was merely a skilled seamstress. But a diary, sealed inside the plantation house walls in 1903 and discovered decades later, tells a different story about forbidden love, hidden family, and the impossible contradictions of the antebellum South. Before we continue with the story of Meridian Grove, hit that subscribe button. Where are you listening from tonight? Drop your state or city in the comments below. The purchase that raised questions. The transaction occurred on March 14, 1834, at the Charleston slave market, and it violated every principle of sound plantation economics that James Ashton had demonstrated in his previous acquisitions. The morning began as it always did at the market, with men and women displayed on wooden platforms, their bodies examined like livestock, their teeth checked for health, their limbs tested for strength. Buyers moved through the crowd with practiced indifference, calculating value with the cold precision that the business demanded. James Ashton had made this journey from Florida 3 times before, always purchasing field workers whose muscled frames promised productivity in the cotton fields, always negotiating prices downward with the ruthless efficiency that had made Meridian Grove one of Jefferson County's most profitable operations. But on this March morning, something shifted in the careful calculations that governed James Ashton's world. He arrived at the auction house with specific instructions to acquire 2 male field hands, young and strong, to replace workers lost to fever the previous summer. The trader showed him several options, all reasonably priced, all meeting his stated requirements. Then, almost as an afterthought, the trader mentioned a woman who had just arrived from Virginia, literate, he said, which typically decreased value rather than increased it, marking her as potentially dangerous rather than desirable in the economy of human bondage. James asked to see her. Eliza was brought forward, 21 years old, wearing a simple dress that had been provided for the auction, her hands clasped in front of her in a posture that suggested neither submission nor defiance, but something else entirely. Her eyes met his, held his gaze for a moment that violated every social convention, then dropped appropriately. The trader quoted a price that made the other buyers turn to look, wondering what qualities could possibly justify such expense. She was not trained in specialized domestic skills that would warrant premium payment. She had no proven record in field work. Her literacy, if genuine, made her suspect rather than valuable in a region where educated slaves were seen as sources of future rebellion. Yet James Ashton examined her papers, looked at her once more, and paid $2,400 without negotiation, a sum that could have purchased 3 prime field workers. The auctioneer paused to confirm the amount, counting the bills twice, making note of the unusual transaction in his ledger. Other buyers whispered among themselves, speculating about what the Florida planter saw that they had missed, wondering if he had lost his mind or knew something they did not. What the assembled bidders could not know was that James Ashton had seen Eliza once before, 6 months earlier, serving at a dinner party in Charleston, where he had been guest to a merchant family. He had watched her move through the rooms with a composure that seemed to mock her chains, carrying trays and pouring wine with efficiency that bordered on grace. He had seen her eyes, intelligent and observant, taking in conversations she was not supposed to understand. And when their gazes met across that dining room, something passed between them that James Ashton could not name. something that had haunted his thoughts through the months that followed. He had made inquiries, discreet questions about her background and abilities, paid for information that confirmed she could read and write as well as most educated white women. He had waited for her to come to market, had traveled to Charleston specifically to purchase her, and had paid whatever price was asked because he knew, with certainty that defied rational explanation, that this woman would transform his life in ways he could not yet imagine. Meridian Grove's architecture of secrecy. The plantation occupied 3,200 acres of prime cotton land in Jefferson County, its boundaries marked by split-rail fences that stretched beyond the limits of easy sight. The main house rose in the Greek Revival style that announced prosperity and social standing to any who approached, its white columns gleaming in the Florida sun, its wide porches suggesting the leisured grace that plantation society aspired to project. Formal gardens surrounded the house, maintained by a dozen enslaved workers whose labor created the illusion that beauty emerged naturally from the land, rather than from constant, exhausting effort. Beyond the gardens lay the cotton fields, acre after acre of plants that would be tended from spring planting through fall harvest by workers who lived in rough wooden cabins, arranged in rows that the master could survey from his upper windows. But it was the property's geography, not its improvements, that made James Ashton's plan possible. A natural depression in the land, perhaps a half-mile from the main house, created a hidden valley where live oaks had grown for generations, their branches spreading and intertwining, until they formed a canopy so dense that little sunlight reached the ground. Spanish moss hung from every branch, creating curtains of gray that obscured sightlines and muffled sound. Previous owners had considered this land useless, too shaded for crops, too uneven for building, a pocket of wilderness that resisted the plantation's organizing logic. James Ashton saw opportunity in what others had dismissed. Within 2 months of Eliza's arrival at Meridian Grove, construction began on what the ledgers called auxiliary staff housing, a deliberately vague description that disguised the true nature of the project. Ashton hired builders from Tallahassee rather than using enslaved workers from his own plantation, paying premium wages in exchange for discretion and speed. The structure that emerged consumed more materials and care than the entire row of slave quarters combined, a fact that would have raised questions had anyone been keeping track of such details. The building featured glass windows that had been shipped from Savannah, their panes reflecting light in ways that rough slave quarters never did. A brick fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney rising high enough to draw properly, but designed to blend with the surrounding trees. Hardwood floors, planed smooth and fitted with precision, covered the interior. 2 separate rooms provided more space than any enslaved family on any plantation in Florida could expect to see. The roof was shingled with materials that would last decades rather than the rough boards that covered most outbuildings. The overseer, Benjamin Fletcher, received his instructions with the practiced neutrality of a man who understood that certain questions were not to be asked. The area surrounding the new structure was to be maintained, weeds cleared and paths kept passable, but never entered without explicit permission from the master himself. The path that led from the main house through the oak grove was designated as Mrs. Ashton's private walking trail, a fiction that explained its maintenance while discouraging others from using it. Any questions about the construction, about its purpose or its occupants, were to be directed to James Ashton personally. Fletcher had worked plantations long enough to recognize secrets when they cast shadows across normal operations. He knew what men did with enslaved women they found attractive, knew that such arrangements were so common as to be unremarkable. But the level of investment, the architectural care, the systematic deception, all suggested something beyond casual exploitation. This looked like permanence, like the establishment of a second household that would exist parallel to the official one, hidden but enduring. Fletcher asked no questions and discouraged them from others, adding this secret to the collection of things he knew but never spoke about, the accumulated knowledge that made him valuable to masters who needed discretion as much as they needed efficiency. Margaret Ashton's calculated ignorance. James Ashton's wife arrived at Meridian Grove in 1829 as the daughter of Savannah's third wealthiest cotton merchant, her marriage the result of negotiations between families, seeking to consolidate wealth and expand influence. Margaret Beaumont had been 24 at the time, considered nearly too old for a first marriage by the standards of her class. But her dowry was substantial enough to overcome any concerns about age. She brought $15,000 in cash and promises of favorable trade arrangements that would give James Ashton access to Savannah's cotton markets on terms that most Florida planters could only envy. The marriage was cordial, but never passionate, a business arrangement that both parties understood and accepted. Margaret managed the household with the efficiency she had learned from her mother, overseeing enslaved domestic workers, planning meals and social events, maintaining the careful accounting that allowed a large household to function. James managed the plantation, the fields, and the workers, the buying and selling that generated the wealth they both enjoyed. They shared a bed occasionally, produced no children in their first 5 years together, and existed in a state of mutual tolerance that passed for marital success in their social circle. By 1834, Margaret Ashton was 31 years old and had learned the lessons that all women of her class eventually absorbed. A wife's security depended on tactical blindness to her husband's indiscretions, on the ability to not see what would be dangerous to acknowledge. She understood, as her mother and grandmother had understood before her, that enslaved women occupied a space where a master's will superseded all moral and legal constraints, that children born of such unions were property rather than kin, that silence preserved social standing, while questions destroyed it. When James announced that he had purchased a seamstress to manage the household's clothing needs, Margaret accepted the explanation with appropriate disinterest. The price seemed excessive for a seamstress, but men often overpaid for things they wanted, and it was not her place to question his business decisions. When construction began on the separate dwelling, she nodded at his explanation that valued servants required better accommodation to ensure loyalty and prevent theft. The logic was sound, even if the expense seemed disproportionate. When she noticed her husband's extended absences in the evenings, she remarked to friends on his dedication to managing even the smallest details of the estate, a quality she presented as admirable rather than suspicious. But Margaret Ashton was not foolish, merely practical. She had been raised by a mother who taught her that a wife's power came not from confronting her husband's behavior, but from documenting it, from maintaining records that could be deployed if circumstances required leverage. Margaret kept meticulous household accounts, noting every expenditure in ledgers that she stored in her private sitting room. In those records, carefully coded in language that would appear innocent to casual review, she documented every purchase that seemed to serve the dwelling in the oak grove rather than the main house. Extra fabric, ordered monthly, far exceeding what the household's acknowledged residents required. Lamp oil, delivered in quantities that suggested multiple dwellings being illuminated nightly. Food purchases, especially delicacies and items that would not typically be provided to enslaved workers. Physician visits, recorded with dates and fees but without explanation of which family member had required treatment. Building materials, acquired long after the initial construction had supposedly been completed, suggesting ongoing improvements and expansions. She was building evidence, creating a detailed record of her husband's secret household, insurance against the day when his arrangement might become public scandal, or when she might need to demonstrate that she had been deceived rather than complicit. Margaret Ashton understood power, understood that knowledge documented became a weapon that could be deployed when circumstances demanded. She watched, she recorded, And she waited, maintaining the fiction of ignorance while systematically cataloging the truth that everyone knew, but no one spoke. Eliza's education and its dangerous implications. The bill of sale that brought Eliza to Meridian Grove noted her literacy in the same tone it might have noted a physical defect, a characteristic that decreased value rather than increased it in the brutal economy of human chattel. But the document could not convey the extent of her education or the dangerous circumstances under which she had acquired it. She had been born in Virginia in 1813 to a mother who served as personal maid to a widow named Caroline Hendricks, a Quaker woman whose husband's death had left her financially secure and ideologically unmoored from the social conventions of the slaveholding class. Mrs. Hendricks had been influenced by the abolitionist writings that circulated quietly through Virginia's northern counties, pamphlets and essays arguing that enslaved people possessed souls equal to white people, that Christian duty demanded not just kind treatment, but education and eventual freedom. She began teaching Eliza's mother to read from the Bible, justifying the lessons as necessary for proper understanding of Scripture, a rationale that placed the education within acceptable religious practice, even if it violated social norms. Eliza, born into this unusual household, learned alongside her mother. She started with letters at age 5, progressing to simple words by 6, reading full passages of Scripture by 8. Mrs. Hendricks, emboldened by the girl's quick intelligence, expanded the lessons beyond religious texts. Eliza learned arithmetic by helping manage household accounts, copying numbers into ledgers under the widow's supervision. She learned geography from maps that Mrs. Hendricks spread across the dining table, pointing out states and countries, explaining trade routes and political boundaries. She learned history from books that the widow owned, but rarely discussed with her white neighbors, texts that examined the American Revolution and the founding of the Republic, with questions about the contradiction between liberty and slavery. By the time Eliza reached 15, she could read and write as well as most educated white women in Virginia, could perform mathematical calculations that would have impressed school teachers, could discuss ideas from books she had consumed in the widow's library during late evenings when her work was finished. But education, in a society built on the premise that enslaved people were property rather than persons, was not liberation, but danger. It made Eliza aware of her degradation in ways that illiterate slaves might not fully grasp. It gave her knowledge of a wider world beyond Virginia, beyond slavery, where people who looked like her lived as free citizens. It made her angry in ways that threatened the fundamental order on which her owner's world depended. When Mrs. Hendricks died in 1832, her children, who did not share their mother's abolitionist sympathies and needed money to settle debts, sold the estate's enslaved workers. Eliza, 20 years old, educated beyond what any potential buyer would consider desirable, passed through 3 owners in 2 years. Each sale drove her further south, further from any possibility of freedom, into regions where literacy was not just discouraged, but outlawed, where enslaved people found with books could be whipped or worse. The trader who eventually brought her to Charleston understood that her education made her difficult to sell. Most buyers wanted ignorance, wanted workers who could not read freedom notices or abolitionist pamphlets, who could not write passes that might facilitate escape. But the trader also understood that certain buyers might value exactly what others feared, that a man looking for conversation, rather than just labor, might pay premium prices for a woman whose intelligence matched her appearance. James Ashton knew about Eliza's education before he purchased her. He had made inquiries, paid for detailed information, confirmed that she could read and write, that she had been exposed to ideas that most enslaved people never encountered. What drew him was not just her beauty, though she possessed that, but her mind. He wanted someone who could understand the books he read, who could discuss philosophy and politics, who could be not just possessed but known. He wanted, though he could not admit this even to himself, a partner rather than property, even if the law would never recognize such distinction. The first year's careful distance. For 12 months after Eliza's arrival at Meridian Grove, James Ashton maintained the fiction that she was indeed a seamstress, that the separate dwelling housed a valued servant, that his visits to the Oak Grove were merely inspections to ensure proper maintenance of property. He came in daylight hours, always with a practical purpose that could be explained if questioned. He brought fabric samples for her to assess, yards of cotton and linen that he claimed needed evaluation for quality before purchase. He brought household items that required mending, shirts with torn seams and tablecloths with frayed edges, creating work that justified his visits while establishing her role as domestic worker rather than something else. They spoke formally during those early months, maintaining the distance that slave and master were expected to observe. She addressed him as Master Ashton, never by his first name, never with the familiarity that might suggest anything beyond proper servant deference. He addressed her as Eliza, not the diminutives or crude nicknames that many masters used for enslaved women, maintaining a courtesy that acknowledged her as a person even if the law did not. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the conversations lengthened. What began as brief exchanges about household tasks expanded into discussions that had nothing to do with sewing or maintenance. James began asking her opinions on matters beyond her assigned work, testing whether her education matched what he had been promised. He brought a newspaper one afternoon, left it with instructions that she should read it and be prepared to discuss its contents. When he returned the next day, she offered analysis of political developments that demonstrated not just literacy, but comprehension, the ability to understand context and implication that went far beyond simply decoding words on a page. He started bringing books from his personal library, volumes of history and philosophy, that he claimed needed rebinding, but actually wanted discussed. She responded carefully, calibrating her intelligence to seem useful without threatening, demonstrating knowledge while maintaining appropriate deference. They discussed Locke's theories of natural rights, and she never directly challenged the contradiction between his philosophy and his ownership of human beings. But she asked questions that forced him to confront those contradictions himself. They examined histories of ancient Rome, and she wondered aloud how a republic built on democratic principles had sustained itself through slave labor, questions that echoed uncomfortably with America's own founding contradictions. James found himself anticipating these visits in ways that disturbed his sense of proper order. He would plan conversations during his morning rides through the cotton fields, rehearsing points he wanted to make, anticipating her responses. He caught himself thinking about her observations hours after leaving the Oak Grove dwelling, turning over arguments she had carefully constructed in language that never directly challenged his authority, but nevertheless presented ideas he had not considered. The turning point came in late winter, 10 months after her arrival, when he brought her a volume of poetry and asked if she enjoyed such things. She admitted that she did, that Mrs. Hendricks had introduced her to verse, that she sometimes composed her own lines, though she had no paper to record them. He provided paper and ink the next day, telling himself it was to assess her handwriting, knowing even as he made the excuse that he was crossing boundaries, he had promised himself he would maintain. It was Eliza who understood before James did what was developing between them, who recognized that his interest was transforming from the crude entitlement that enslaved women learned to fear into something more complex and, in its own way, more dangerous. She saw in his visits a loneliness that matched her own, a desire for connection that transcended the physical exploitation she had been prepared to endure. But she also understood the fundamental impossibility of their situation, that any relationship between them would be built on the foundation of his power over her, that even genuine affection could not overcome the legal reality that he owned her absolutely and could dispose of her at any moment without consequence or appeal. The night. Everything changed. On February 3, 1835, a winter storm struck northern Florida with unusual violence. the temperature dropping below freezing as rain turned to ice that coated the live oaks in crystalline shells. Wind howled through the plantation, rattling shutters and tearing loose branches that fell like artillery across the grounds. James Ashton stood in his study, watching the storm intensify, and found himself consumed with worry about the dwelling in the oak grove. The small fireplace he had installed would be insufficient against cold this severe. The structure, built for privacy rather than brutal weather, might not withstand winds that were already damaging buildings constructed with far greater solidity. He made the decision without consulting his wife, without considering how the choice would appear if discovered. He gathered extra blankets from the household stores, collected firewood from the covered supply behind the kitchen, and walked the path through the oak grove in darkness, broken only by occasional lightning that turned the world silver in shadow. Ice crunched beneath his boots, branches groaned overhead, and the temperature seemed to drop with each step he took away from the main house. Eliza met him at the door, surprise evident in her expression despite her attempt to maintain proper servant composure. She had been sitting close to the fire, wrapped in the thin blanket that was all she possessed, trying to preserve warmth against cold that penetrated the walls. James entered without invitation, set down his burden, and began building up the fire with wood he had carried. Neither spoke as he worked, the silence between them heavy with awareness that something fundamental was shifting. When the fire blazed properly, Eliza prepared tea from herbs she grew in a small garden behind the dwelling, moving through the routine with practiced efficiency, while James arranged the extra blankets and made the room as warm as circumstances allowed. They sat in chairs placed at careful distance across the room, maintaining the physical separation that propriety demanded, even as the storm outside and the intimacy of the late hour dissolved other boundaries. What began as concern for her welfare became a conversation that stretched through the night, both of them speaking more honestly than either had imagined possible. James told her about his father's death, about inheriting a plantation he had not wanted, about becoming the kind of man he had once despised. He spoke of his marriage, not with criticism of Margaret, but with acknowledgement of its emptiness. The way two people could share a house and a life, yet remain fundamentally unknown to each other. Eliza told him about her mother, about learning to read in secret after Mrs. Hendricks died, about surviving by teaching herself to be valuable in ways that might preserve some dignity in a system designed to strip her of it. She spoke of the terror of being sold repeatedly, of understanding that each sale took her further from any possibility of freedom, that she had expected to end her days in fields or factories. Her education wasted, her intelligence deliberately suppressed. As dawn approached, James Ashton made a choice that would define the rest of his life. He did not return to the main house, and in that failure to leave, in that deliberate remaining, everything changed between them irrevocably. The architecture of a hidden life. The months following that February night required James Ashton to become an architect of deception, constructing a double life with precision he had once applied to cotton cultivation. His visits to the Oak Grove dwelling became routine but carefully managed, timed to moments when his wife was occupied with household management, when the overseer was supervising field work in distant quarters, when servants were engaged in tasks that kept them far from the hidden path. He established patterns that would seem natural if questioned, creating rhythms that appeared part of normal plantation operations rather than secret meetings. Evening walks for his health became his primary excuse, a habit he cultivated publicly before using it privately. He would announce his intention to walk before dinner, take a visible route past the gardens where servants could witness his departure, then circle through less observed areas to reach the Oak Grove. Morning inspections of property boundaries provided another cover, allowing him to disappear for hours under the legitimate pretense of surveying fence lines and checking for encroachment from neighboring properties. The dwelling itself underwent continuous expansion and improvement, additions that never appeared in formal construction records, paid for with personal funds that bypassed the plantation's accounting systems. He installed a small library, moving books from his own collection in quantities small enough to avoid notice, but sufficient to create a space where Eliza could continue her education. Volumes of history and philosophy lined shelves he built himself during hours supposedly spent on other tasks. Each book selected not just for its content, but for its potential to spark conversations that filled his evenings. He arranged for a piano to be delivered, explaining to Margaret that it was destined for a family in Tallahassee, allowing it to await transport and storage that was, in fact, the Oak Grove dwelling. Eliza had mentioned once that Mrs. Hendricks had taught her basic piano skills, and James found himself unable to resist providing an instrument. The music she played in isolation, becoming a private concert that only he would hear. The separation between his two lives was absolute and exhausting. In the main house, he performed the role of plantation master with increasing detachment, attending to cotton yields and market prices with mechanical efficiency, entertaining neighboring planters with forced enthusiasm, maintaining social performances that felt hollow. He shared meals with Margaret, discussed household matters, fulfilled marital obligations with decreasing frequency, the physical intimacy between them dying slowly as his emotional life migrated entirely to the Oak Grove. In the hidden dwelling, he was simply James, reading beside Eliza in evenings lit by lamps that burned too expensively for slave quarters, discussing ideas that would scandalize the society that sustained his wealth, existing in a space that denied every law and custom of the world beyond those walls. They talked until late hours, fell asleep in chairs positioned near the fire, woke to dawn light filtering through windows that faced east to catch the morning sun. The exhaustion of maintaining parallel existences aged him in ways that others began to notice, his face developing lines that suggested burdens beyond normal plantation management, his temperament becoming more withdrawn as the energy required to sustain the deception consumed resources he had once devoted to social engagement. The birth of the first child, Thomas Ashton, though he could never legally bear that name, was born on November 12, 1835, in the dwelling hidden among the live oaks, with only a midwife present who was paid $50 to ensure her silence and threatened with sale to brutal sugar plantations to ensure her cooperation. The labor lasted 14 hours and James remained throughout, pacing outside the dwelling, when the midwife ordered him away from the birthing room, rushing back inside whenever Eliza cried out in pain that he could hear but not ease. When the midwife finally called him in, James Ashton held his son for the first time in a room that officially did not exist, looked into eyes that held his own features reflected back, and understood with devastating clarity that he had created a human being who could never be acknowledged. The infant weighed 7 pounds, had all his fingers and toes, possessed lungs that worked perfectly, as demonstrated by cries that seemed impossibly loud for such a small creature. The midwife cleaned the child, wrapped him in soft cloth that James had purchased weeks earlier in preparation, and placed him in his father's arms with an expression that suggested she understood far more than she would ever speak about. The baby was legally his property. Under Florida law, children followed the condition of their mother, meaning that Thomas was enslaved from birth, owned absolutely by the man who had fathered him, subject to sale or disposal at his owner's discretion. James could, at any moment and for any reason, separate this child from Eliza, could sell him away without her consent or appeal, could treat him with any degree of cruelty or kindness that suited his mood without consequence, beyond the loss of property value if the treatment damaged the child's ability to work. The impossibility of his situation crashed over James with the weight of the infant in his arms. He loved Eliza in a way that his marriage had never approached. felt emotions when he was with her that seemed more real than anything he experienced in his official life. And he already loved this child with an intensity that terrified him, felt protective instincts that made him understand for the first time what parents meant when they said they would die for their children. Yet every law, every social convention, every foundation of his economic existence declared that this love was impossible, that these people were things he owned rather than family he cherished. There was no legal mechanism to free them without sacrificing everything he possessed and sending them into exile. Florida law required freed slaves to leave the state within 90 days or face re-enslavement, a provision designed to ensure that free black people could not establish communities that might threaten the slave system. So James Ashton made the choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He would keep them close, hidden but protected, property in law but family in the only truth that mattered, living a contradiction that would slowly consume his soul. Margaret Ashton's strategic revelations. 3 weeks after Thomas's birth, Margaret Ashton entered her husband's study without knocking and placed a leather-bound ledger on his desk with deliberate precision. The sound of the book hitting the mahogany surface carried more weight than its physical mass could explain, a declaration of knowledge that required no verbal announcement. Inside were her meticulously documented records of every expenditure that exceeded normal household needs, every unexplained absence spanning back to Eliza's arrival, every detail that pointed to the existence of the Oak Grove household. James opened the ledger, saw his secret, documented in his wife's precise handwriting, dates and amounts recorded with accounting accuracy that would satisfy any auditor. Purchase of glass windows, quantities of lamp oil, food deliveries, physician visits, all coded in language that appeared innocent to casual review, but told a complete story when examined with intention. Margaret had been building this evidence for nearly 2 years, documenting his deception with the same systematic care she applied to all household management. She did not need to say that she knew. The ledger spoke clearly enough. She did not need to threaten exposure. They both understood the consequences if this information reached their social circle, the scandal that would destroy not just James's reputation, but Margaret's position as well. What followed was not an argument, but a negotiation between two people who understood that their interests, while diverging, were not necessarily opposed. Margaret made her terms explicit with the directness of a business transaction. She would maintain the fiction that the dwelling housed valued servants, that any children born there were products of liaisons between enslaved workers that did not concern respectable people. She would participate in the social performances that protected both their reputations, would ensure that Jefferson County society never had cause to look too closely at Meridian Grove's unusual domestic arrangements. In exchange, James would provide substantial increases in her household allowance, money that would be hers alone to manage without accounting to him. He would transfer ownership of a townhouse in Tallahassee into her name exclusively, ensuring her financial independence regardless of what happened to their marriage. Most importantly, he would commit in writing that the children of his arrangement with Eliza would never be positioned to claim inheritance rights, would never be recognized in any legal capacity that might threaten the future of any legitimate children they might still produce together. James agreed because he had no alternative. Margaret held power that came from her willingness to speak truths he needed kept silent. She could destroy everything he had built in the Oak Grove simply by acknowledging publicly what everyone privately suspected, by forcing society to address what it had agreed to ignore. Her silence was not free, and the price would be paid in money, property, and legal guarantees that formalized what had always been true. The marriage, already a business arrangement, became an explicit compact recorded in documents that Margaret's lawyer prepared and James signed. Neither spoke of love. Neither mentioned morality or jealousy or hurt feelings. They simply acknowledged the reality of power and the compromises it demanded. Two people trapped in roles neither had chosen, negotiating terms that would allow them both to survive with positions intact. The education of contraband children. By 1838, with 2 children born and a third anticipated, James Ashton faced a question that consumed his nights in sleepless calculation. How could he educate children who could not be publicly acknowledged, who could not attend school, who could not be seen by tutors without risking discovery? His solution was to teach them himself, transforming the Oak Grove dwelling into a peculiar kind of schoolroom, where children who were legally property received better education than most white children of their class. Thomas, at age 3, was learning his letters, tracing them on a slate, while his father guided his small hand through the proper formations. The boy showed early intelligence, absorbing lessons with speed that both delighted and frightened James, who understood that every increase in his son's capabilities made the child's captivity more unbearable. Rachel, born in 1837, was still an infant but would soon join her brother at the small table James had built specifically for their lessons. James brought primers and slates during visits he justified as estate business, children's books he purchased on trips to Charleston and Savannah, explaining them as gifts for a non-existent nephew when merchants asked. He brought maps and globes, histories and philosophies, mathematics texts and science volumes, creating a curriculum that exceeded what most schools provided. The dwelling's shelves filled with learning materials that represented both James's love and his guilt, physical manifestations of his attempt to compensate for the freedom he could not give. Eliza, whose education had been interrupted at 15 when Mrs. Hendricks died, studied alongside her children, advancing her own learning, while helping James develop lessons appropriate for young minds. They read together in evenings after the children slept, discussing pedagogical approaches, debating which subjects should be introduced at which ages, creating an educational program that existed nowhere else in the South. But education created its own dangers that James understood too late to prevent. Literate enslaved people were suspect throughout the region. Educated ones were illegal in many contexts. Florida law prohibited teaching slaves to read, though enforcement was inconsistent and penalties were rarely applied to masters who violated the statute. Still, the risk was real. If Thomas or Rachel were ever seen beyond the Oak Grove, their intelligence would draw questions immediately. Their bearing would suggest free birth. Their very existence would threaten the carefully maintained fiction. James found himself in another impossible position that characterized every aspect of his double life. He was giving his children tools that would allow them to understand their degradation more fully than illiterate slaves ever could. Knowledge that would make their captivity more unbearable rather than less. Awareness that would force them to recognize that their father's love could not overcome the system that made them his property. Thomas, even at 3, seemed to sense something wrong in their isolation, asked questions about why they never left the Oak Grove, why his father came only at certain times and left before dawn. James had no answers that a child could understand, no explanation that made their situation acceptable, only promises that things would change someday, vague assurances that avoided the truth he could not speak. The overseer's suspicious observations. Benjamin Fletcher had overseen Meridian Grove for 7 years by 1838, and he prided himself on being a man who understood the boundaries of acceptable curiosity about his employer's private affairs. Plantation overseers who asked too many questions about what masters did with their property tended to find themselves seeking new employment, and Fletcher had cultivated professional blindness to the types of behavior that were common enough to be unremarkable in the plantation economy of northern Florida. But there were details about James Ashton's habits that troubled Fletcher in ways he could not entirely dismiss. The master's absences had become more frequent and more prolonged, hours disappearing from his schedule with explanations that seemed plausible individually, but created suspicious patterns when observed collectively. Morning inspections of property boundaries that consumed entire afternoons, evening walks for health that lasted well past dark, consultations with livestock that required no actual consultation, given that Fletcher managed those operations independently. Supplies were disappearing from the plantation stores in quantities that exceeded normal household consumption. Food staples, lamp oil, firewood, fabric, all requisitioned in amounts that suggested more people consuming them than the main house contained. Fletcher maintained careful inventory records, and the discrepancies were becoming too substantial to attribute to simple accounting errors or normal household waste. The physician's visits followed no pattern of illness in the main house. Dr. Harrison arrived quarterly, sometimes more frequently, always with instructions to bill his services to Meridian Grove, but never with explanations of which family member required treatment. Fletcher had asked once, casually, whether Mrs. Ashton was unwell, and had received a response so deliberately vague that it confirmed the visits had nothing to do with the master's wife. Most significantly, children were appearing in Jefferson County's vital records. Births documented at Meridian Grove, but belonging to no woman whose name appeared in the plantation's slave manifest. The county clerk recorded them as mulatto, noted their birth location, listed no parents, and moved on to other business. But Fletcher, who maintained his own records of enslaved workers and their offspring for purposes of property valuation and labor planning, had no corresponding entries in his books. Fletcher understood the basic arrangement. Masters kept women, fathered children with them, sometimes showed preference to particular enslaved families. None of this was unusual or worth remarking upon, but the level of secrecy surrounding Ashton's situation, the architectural investments in the Oak Grove dwelling, the systematic deception of even the plantation's internal records, all suggested something beyond casual exploitation. This looked like a parallel household, a hidden family, an arrangement approaching permanence. And permanence was dangerous because it gave an enslaved woman power that no slave should possess. Knowledge of the master's weakness, leverage that could transform fundamental power dynamics, influence that could disrupt the careful discipline on which plantation operations depended. Fletcher's concern was not moral, but practical. Such secrets demanded too much energy to maintain, created vulnerabilities where operations could be disrupted, represented risks to the smooth functioning that justified his employment and salary. So Fletcher began keeping his own records, noting dates and times, documenting movements, building a file that he stored carefully in his quarters, not as evidence to reveal, but as insurance against the day when this secret might spiral beyond control. The third and fourth children. Daniel was born in 1840, and Sarah in 1842, and with each birth the impossibility of James Ashton's life became more pronounced, the contradictions he lived daily growing heavier until they seemed to physically weigh on his frame. 4 children now, all bearing his features in ways that would be unmistakable to anyone who saw them side by side with their father, all legally classified as slaves worth approximately $300 each in the market that valued human beings like livestock, all hidden away in a dwelling that officially housed valued servants, but actually contained the only family James felt he truly possessed. His visits to the main house became perfunctory exercises in maintaining appearances, time spent fulfilling obligations to a wife he respected but did not love, existing in rooms that felt increasingly like stage sets for a performance he no longer believed in. He attended meals, discussed household matters with Margaret, reviewed plantation accounts, entertained neighboring planters with conversation about cotton prices and weather patterns. But his mind was always elsewhere, calculating when he could return to the Oak Grove, counting hours until he could be with Eliza and the children who called him Papa in whispers. His real life, his authentic self, existed in the hidden dwelling where 4 children grew and learned, where Eliza sat beside him in evenings discussing books while the young ones slept in the next room, where he could almost pretend that the legal and social reality beyond those walls did not exist. He read to them nightly, stories that transported them to worlds where their circumstances might be different. He taught them songs and helped them construct toys from wood scraps he brought from the plantation's workshops. He held them when they cried and celebrated their small accomplishments with pride that could never be shown publicly. But pretending required constant vigilance that exhausted him more than physical labor ever had. The children had to understand from ages so young they could barely comprehend the explanation that they could never leave the oak grove, that the world beyond would see them as property, that even their father's love could not protect them if they were discovered. Thomas, now 7 years old, was old enough to grasp the essential cruelty of his situation, possessed enough intelligence to recognize that he had a father who loved him and a father who owned him, and these two facts existed in tension that no philosophy could resolve. Rachel, at 5, understood only that there were rules she must never break, boundaries she must never cross, that safety lay in invisibility and silence. Daniel and Sarah were too young yet for such understanding, but it would come as it came to all children born into impossible circumstances. The knowledge that love and captivity could coexist, that the man who read them stories at night held legal power to sell them in the morning. James found himself trapped between competing moral claims with no resolution that did not require him to betray someone he loved, no choice that would not destroy either the family he had created in secret or the position that allowed him to protect them. The diary that would condemn them all. Eleanor Ashton arrived at Meridian Grove in the spring of 1842, following the death of her husband, a Charleston merchant who had left her financially secure but emotionally devastated. She was 34 years old, childless, seeking the comfort of family during grief that made normal social interactions unbearable. Margaret welcomed her sister-in-law with genuine warmth, grateful for company that might relieve the peculiar loneliness of her marriage. James greeted Eleanor with affection tempered by caution, conscious that her presence would require additional care in maintaining his secret. What James could not have anticipated was Eleanor's habit of walking at dawn, her need for solitude in nature to process grief that kept her awake through long nights. She had always been drawn to wild spaces, found peace in landscapes that resisted human ordering, and Meridian Grove's grounds offered acres of such territory to explore. On her 4th morning at the plantation, following a path that seemed to lead nowhere in particular, Eleanor discovered the dwelling in the oak grove quite by accident. She approached quietly, drawn by sounds of children's laughter that seemed incongruous in this hidden place. Through a window, she saw a domestic scene that stopped her breath and forced her to understand in an instant what her brother had been hiding. James sat at a table, a small boy beside him reading from a book, both of them focused on the text with identical expressions of concentration. A woman Eleanor recognized as enslaved by her dress but whose bearing suggested something else entirely moved through the room, with the ease of someone in her own home rather than master's property. 2 younger children played on a rug, their features unmistakably mixed race, their resemblance to James undeniable once Eleanor knew to look for it. The intimacy of the scene, the obvious affection, the complete domesticity, told Eleanor everything she needed to know about what her brother had created here. This was not the casual exploitation that everyone understood plantation masters engaged in. This was a family, hidden but real, maintained in secret because society would not allow it to exist in public. That night Eleanor began a diary, compelled by something she could not entirely name to document what she had witnessed. She was not motivated by judgment or disapproval, felt no moral outrage at her brother's transgression of social norms. If anything, she found the situation strangely moving, evidence that James possessed capacity for genuine feeling that his marriage to Margaret had never revealed. But she was also a woman trained in documentation, raised in a merchant family that valued accurate records, and she could not witness something so significant without creating an account. Over the following weeks, she recorded what she observed through careful watching and discreet questions that never revealed her knowledge. She documented the times James disappeared, the supplies that went to the oak grove, the physician's visits that served no one in the main house. She wrote descriptions of the children, noting their ages and features, recording the education they received that exceeded what most white children could access. Eleanor's diary would become evidence that outlasted them all. The community's willful blindness. Jefferson County's planter class operated on a system of mutual discretion that sustained their entire social structure. An unspoken agreement that certain types of behavior would be noticed, but never discussed, acknowledged privately, but never publicly addressed. The quarterly gatherings at various plantation houses, ostensibly social events celebrating successful harvests or seasonal milestones, functioned primarily as forums where men negotiated this delicate balance between knowing and not knowing, between seeing and not seeing. Every man at these gatherings understood that James Ashton kept a woman. Several had glimpsed Eliza during his rare public appearances with her at markets or shops in Tallahassee, always in contexts where her presence could be explained as a trusted servant running errands for her master's household. The explanation satisfied, because everyone agreed to accept it, because questioning one man's arrangement would open all arrangements to scrutiny that no one wanted. Rumors circulated in the careful language that allowed serious matters to be discussed, without being officially acknowledged. The separate dwelling in the oak grove was known, though most claimed to have heard about it second-hand rather than witnessed it personally. Children who resembled the master but were never seen had been mentioned in conversations that trailed off before reaching conclusions. Expenditures that exceeded normal plantation operations had been noted by merchants who supplied multiple estates and could compare purchasing patterns. But no one spoke of it directly, never forced the issue into open conversation that would require response rather than tactical ignorance. To do so would necessitate addressing the same arrangements that existed on their own properties, would open examination of practices that were common enough to be structural rather than exceptional throughout the slave-holding South. The difference, which everyone quietly recognized, was one of degree and implication that made James Ashton's situation more threatening than typical master-slave exploitation. Most planners used enslaved women and moved on, acknowledged no offspring, maintained no ongoing relationships. These arrangements were understood as exercises of property rights, expressions of power that reinforced rather than challenged the fundamental order. James Ashton appeared to have built something approaching a genuine second family, and that was dangerous because it suggested that enslaved people might be capable of relationships that white society insisted they could not experience. It implied that children of mixed race might deserve consideration beyond their value as property. It threatened the ideological foundations that justified the entire system by demonstrating that the boundaries between master and slave, between owner and family, might be more permeable than the law acknowledged. If James Ashton's arrangement became public scandal rather than private knowledge, it would force questions that the entire economic and social system depended on not asking. It would require society to confront the humanity of people it had agreed to treat as property, to acknowledge the existence of love and family in contexts where such things were legally impossible. So the community maintained its practice blindness, saw only what preserved consensus, ignored what would disrupt the careful equilibrium. Men who knew gathered at social events, discussed cotton and politics, and never mentioned the secret that everyone carried, waiting to see if James Ashton's contradiction would eventually collapse under its own impossible weight. Thomas's dangerous awakening. At age 9, Thomas had inherited his father's intelligence and his mother's penetrating clarity of vision. and together these qualities made it impossible for James to maintain the comforting fictions that had sustained them through the boy's early childhood. The questions began simply enough, the natural curiosity of a child noticing that his life differed from descriptions he read in books his father provided. But they evolved into interrogations that demanded honest answers James could not provide, without destroying whatever innocence his son still possessed. Why could he not leave the oak grove when other children his age roamed freely? Thomas had read stories of boys exploring, having adventures beyond their homes, and he wanted to understand what prevented him from similar experiences. Why did his father never acknowledge him in the presence of others? The boy had glimpsed through careful observation moments when James passed near the oak grove with plantation visitors, had seen his father's face remain deliberately blank, pretending not to see his own son watching from windows. Why was he taught reading and mathematics and history that he would never be allowed to use? Thomas understood that his education exceeded what most children received, had absorbed enough from his lessons to recognize that knowledge without application became a form of torture, awareness of possibilities that would never materialize into actual opportunities. James tried to explain in terms a 9-year-old might grasp, struggled to find language that would convey truth without crushing hope entirely. The world beyond the oak grove operated by rules that were unjust, he said. Their family existed in opposition to those rules. Constraints that Thomas must accept were temporary and would someday end. But even as he spoke, James knew he was offering promises he could not fulfill, creating expectations he had no means to satisfy. Thomas pressed for specifics with the relentless logic of a child who had been taught to think critically and now applied those skills to his own circumstances. When would the constraints end? How? By what mechanism would his father's ownership of his mother and himself be dissolved? What specific plans existed to transform their situation from what it was into something resembling the freedom that Thomas read about in books but had never experienced? James had no answers because no answers existed within the legal framework of Florida in 1844. He could not free them without forcing them into exile, could not acknowledge them without losing everything that allowed him to protect them, could not resolve the fundamental contradiction of loving people he legally owned. Manumission required leaving the state within 90 days, meant sending them into a world that offered no protection, no security, no recognition of their right to exist as free people. So James did what parents do when truth offers no comfort. He made promises he could not keep, told Thomas that things would change, that the boy's intelligence would someday find proper use, that their family would find a way to exist openly. Thomas listened with the expression of a child who knows he is being told stories rather than truth, who loves his father enough to accept the fiction for now, but who will remember these evasions when time comes for harder reckonings. Margaret's price for continued silence. By 1845, 11 years into James's arrangement with Eliza, Margaret Ashton's tolerance had been sustained by strategic silence that was not without cost, and she decided it was time to renegotiate the terms of her complicity. The conversation took place in the formal parlor on a February afternoon, the setting chosen deliberately to emphasize the transactional nature of their relationship, the business arrangement that their marriage had always been and had now become explicitly. Margaret entered with documents already prepared, evidence that she had been planning this confrontation for months, perhaps years. She placed papers on the mahogany table between them, legal documents drafted by her personal attorney in Tallahassee, a man whose discretion she had purchased with fees substantial enough to ensure his loyalty superseded any obligation to her husband. Her demands were specific and carefully calculated to protect her interests, while maintaining the secret that benefited them both. First, she required a legal document, witnessed and notarized, that clearly established the inheritance rights of any legitimate children they might produce to the exclusion of any others who might exist. The language was deliberately vague about who these others might be, but both understood perfectly what the clause addressed. Second, she wanted property in her own name alone, assets that could not be touched by James's debts or decisions, security that would survive whatever scandal might eventually erupt. She specified a townhouse in Tallahassee, one she had already identified and whose current owner was willing to sell for the right price. The property would provide her refuge if circumstances made remaining at Meridian Grove impossible, would ensure her financial independence regardless of what happened to their marriage. Third, and most importantly, she demanded that James never acknowledge the Oak Grove children in any capacity, even in private documents, even in his will, that their existence remain legally invisible regardless of what happened to him or to them. If James died, the children would be disposed of as property through the estate, sold to settle debts or distributed among heirs, with no consideration given to their connection to the Ashton family. Margaret delivered these terms without emotion, her voice carrying the flat affect of someone conducting business rather than negotiating the fate of human beings. She was not cruel by temperament, but she had been raised in a world where enslaved people were property first and persons only incidentally, where protecting one's legitimate family required absolute clarity about who belonged and who did not. James agreed because he had no alternative that did not destroy everything. Margaret held power that came from her willingness to speak truths he needed kept silent, could at any moment transform private knowledge into public scandal, simply by acknowledging what everyone suspected but no one discussed. Her silence had a price, and that price would be paid in legal guarantees and property transfers that formalized what had always been true. He signed the documents, authorized the property purchase, and watched his wife leave the parlor satisfied. James remained in his chair, understanding more fully than ever before that he was not the master of his situation, but its prisoner, trapped between competing moral claims with no resolution that did not require betraying someone he loved. The Overseer's Ultimatum. In the spring of 1846, Benjamin Fletcher requested a private meeting with James Ashton in the Plantation office, and the conversation that followed threatened to collapse the entire architecture of secrets that had been maintained for 12 years. Fletcher arrived with a leather portfolio under his arm, his expression carrying none of the deference that overseers typically showed their employers, his bearing suggesting a man who understood he held leverage and intended to use it. He laid out what he had observed, what he had documented in meticulous detail over years of careful watching. The pattern of James's absences, the discrepancies in supply inventories, the physician's unexplained visits, the children who appeared in county records but belonged to no woman in the plantation's manifest. Fletcher had compiled evidence that would be devastating if presented to the right audiences, proof that James Ashton maintained a second household, that he had fathered children with an enslaved woman, that substantial plantation resources had been diverted to support this arrangement. Fletcher made clear that his concern was not moral judgment but practical risk management. Other enslaved people on the plantation had begun to notice the master's special treatment of Eliza and her children, the double standard that allowed one family to live in comfort, while others labored in fields and lived in rough quarters. Resentment was building in ways Fletcher could observe but not entirely control. Discipline was becoming harder to maintain, and the secret was approaching the point where containment would become impossible. He presented James with options, each one framed as reasonable solutions to an untenable situation. Sell Eliza and the children away, ending the arrangement and returning Meridian Grove to normal operations. Or formalize her status in some public way that explained the resources devoted to her household. Perhaps, claiming she was a valued servant whose skills justified unusual accommodation. Both options preserved the plantation's functioning while eliminating the source of growing instability. James rejected both immediately, his voice carrying an intensity that surprised even himself. He would not separate his family, would not send them away, could not imagine his life without them, regardless of what practical considerations might recommend. Fletcher had anticipated this response, had prepared for exactly this reaction, and delivered his actual demand. He required a substantial increase in salary, doubling what he currently received. He wanted legal partnership in the plantation's profits, a percentage ownership that would make him invested in Meridian Grove's success rather than merely employed by it. Most importantly, he demanded written immunity from any consequences should the secret eventually become public scandal, legal protection that would shield him from accusations of complicity or participation in whatever violations might be charged. Fletcher was essentially demanding to be bought into the conspiracy, to become a partner whose interests aligned with maintaining, rather than revealing the secret. James agreed because refusal would mean an immediate exposure, because Fletcher could destroy everything simply by speaking publicly what he had documented privately. They signed documents that afternoon. Fletcher's salary increased, his percentage ownership established, his immunity guaranteed in writing that James's attorney prepared, with expressions suggesting deep misgivings about the entire arrangement. Eliza's impossible position. 12 years into her life at Meridian Grove, Eliza occupied a position that had no name in the social or legal vocabulary of the antebellum South, a space that existed between categories that were supposed to be absolute and impermeable. She was enslaved yet lived in comfort that most free women of her race would never experience, owned property, including clothing, and books that technically belonged to her master, but functionally served as her possessions. She was legally powerless, yet exercised influence over the man who owned her, could shape his decisions through conversations that he valued more than advice from white advisors. The psychological weight of this contradiction was something James could never fully understand, protected as he was by his gender and race and legal status from ever experiencing the fundamental precariousness that defined Eliza's existence. She lived in constant awareness that everything she possessed, every moment of security and affection, every resource devoted to her children's education, depended entirely on James's continued goodwill and living presence. If he died tomorrow, she and the children would become property to be disposed of according to his will, which Margaret had ensured would not acknowledge them. If he tired of her, if his affection cooled or circumstances changed, the arrangement could end without warning, without recourse, without any mechanism for her to appeal or resist. She had no legal standing to contest separation from her children, no protected rights to the dwelling she occupied, no guarantee that promises made today would be honored tomorrow. The man who claimed to love her held absolute power over her, could sell her children away individually if it became convenient, could reassign her to field labor if she displeased him, could exercise any cruelty or kindness that suited his mood. And even James's love, genuine as it might be, was compromised by the fundamental imbalance of power between them that could never be overcome while she remained his property. Could she ever truly know if her affection for him was authentic or merely the adaptation of a captive who had learned to love her captor as survival strategy? Could James know if her expressions of love were genuine or performances necessary to maintain the security she had achieved for herself and her children? The questions had no answers, only the daily reality of a relationship built on a foundation of coercion, sustained by a system of violence that operated whether James personally wielded it or not, maintained through a conspiracy of silence that required Eliza to be grateful for conditions that never should have existed. She was expected to feel fortunate that her master loved her rather than simply used her, that her children received education rather than being sold away as infants, that she lived in relative comfort rather than brutal exploitation. But gratitude for lesser evils did not transform those evils into good, did not change the fact that everything good in her life existed at the discretion of a man whose legal relationship to her was defined by ownership. Eliza understood this with clarity that made sleep difficult and happiness complicated, understood that she loved a man who could never truly be her partner, because the law made him her master, first and always. The discovery that changed everything. On September 14, 1847, Eleanor Ashton's diary was discovered by a visiting friend from Savannah, a woman named Caroline Hartwell, who had come to Meridian Grove for a brief stay and who happened to be a correspondent for an abolitionist newspaper published in Philadelphia. The discovery occurred by accident, Eleanor having left the diary in a sitting room where Caroline found it while looking for reading material during an afternoon when her hostess was occupied with household matters. Caroline began reading out of curiosity, expecting the typical observations of plantation life that women of Eleanor's class recorded. Instead, she found detailed documentation of James Ashton's hidden family, descriptions of children who bore their father's features but lived as slaves, accounts of a domestic arrangement that demonstrated everything abolitionists argued about the moral contradictions of the slave system. The diary proved that enslaved people were capable of the same family bonds that white society claimed were unique marks of civilization, showed that masters themselves recognized this humanity even as they denied it publicly. Caroline made a decision that would set in motion events no one at Meridian Grove could control. She copied key passages, changing names but preserving details, and sent them north to editors who understood immediately the propaganda value of the story. A southern plantation owner who loved his enslaved woman and their children, who kept them hidden because society would not accept their existence, who demonstrated through his very secrecy that enslaved people were fully human, capable of love and family, and all the emotions that slavery's defenders insisted they could not feel. The account was published in October 1847 under the headline, "The Hidden Family: Love and Bondage in the Slave South." The article was carefully anonymized but included enough specific details that anyone familiar with Jefferson County could identify the plantation and family described. It spread through abolitionist networks with remarkable speed, was reprinted in newspapers across the North, became a topic of discussion in churches and meeting halls where anti-slavery sentiment was growing. Eventually, the article made its way south, carried by travelers and mail routes that connected even isolated Florida plantations to broader information networks. When it reached Jefferson County in November, the community that had maintained careful silence for 13 years suddenly found itself forced to acknowledge publicly what it had privately always known. Social pressure demanded response because northern newspapers had made the arrangement a public scandal, because ignoring it now would seem like endorsement of behavior that threatened the ideological foundations of slave society. Other planters, terrified that tolerance of Ashton's situation might encourage similar arrangements or give ammunition to abolitionist critics, began calling for investigation. The sheriff, who had previously seen nothing worth examining despite years of rumors, suddenly discovered his duty to inquire into reports of irregular domestic situations. And Margaret Ashton, who had preserved the secret to protect her own position, found herself facing exactly the exposure she had feared, the scandal that threatened her children's future prospects and her own social standing, all because her sister-in-law had written down what should have remained forever unspoken. The Reckoning and its Aftermath. The investigation that followed the publication lasted 6 months and concluded with outcomes that satisfied no one while destroying many. James Ashton was not charged with any crime, because keeping an enslaved woman and fathering children with her violated no Florida law represented practices so common as to be unremarkable, except when forced into public scrutiny. But the publicity made his situation impossible to maintain, transformed private arrangement into public scandal that demanded response. Social pressure from other planters forced him toward impossible choices. Sell Eliza and the children away, demonstrating that his loyalties lay with his class and race, rather than with people the law defined as property. Or face complete ostracism and potential economic ruin, as other plantation owners refused to conduct business with a man who had elevated enslaved people to near-family status, who had allowed love to override the fundamental distinctions that slave society depended upon maintaining absolutely. In February 1848, facing bankruptcy as suppliers refused credit and buyers rejected his cotton, James Ashton made a third choice that no one had anticipated. He freed Eliza and all 4 children, providing them with forged free papers claiming they had been born free in the Caribbean, giving them money sufficient to reach Philadelphia and establish themselves in the North where free black communities existed with some security. The manumission cost him everything he had built over 2 decades of plantation management. Margaret divorced him immediately, taking the Tallahassee property and half his remaining assets as the separation agreement entitled her. His legitimate children, a son and daughter born in his later years with Margaret, were raised by their mother's family and taught to despise the father who had chosen the enslaved people over them, who had sacrificed their inheritance for a family that society insisted should not exist. Other planters refused to trade with him, and Meridian Grove's operations collapsed within a year of Eliza's departure. James sold the property at devastating loss, paid debts that consumed what remained of his wealth, and spent his final years in a boarding house in Tallahassee, broken by alcohol and regret. He died in 1851, only 44 years old, having sacrificed everything for a family he could never publicly acknowledge and who could never return to Florida without risking re-enslavement under fugitive slave laws that made even free papers insufficient protection. Eliza and the 4 children survived in Philadelphia, living under assumed names that made them invisible to slave catchers, but also erased the truth of their origin. Thomas became a teacher in schools for black children, Rachel, a seamstress whose skills supported the family through difficult years, Daniel, a carpenter whose work was respected enough to bring steady employment. Sarah, the youngest, became a writer who would much later publish a memoir under a pseudonym, telling the story of Meridian Grove in language that Northern readers embraced as evidence of slavery's horror, while Southern readers dismissed as abolitionist propaganda. The truth, as always, was more complicated than either side wanted to acknowledge. A story of love that could not overcome the systems designed to make such love impossible.